Welcome back. Thank you for joining us again. So this is supposed to be more of an open discussion. I'll try to throw there some questions to start the conversation, but feel free to ask each other or comment. And also then we'll open it to the public to ask any questions. So basically what I was trying to do is to find a line to weave between all of the talks, the very interesting actually and very rich talks we've heard, and also relating it to the main question of deserting and finding different or forming different ways for non-fascist living, and how to work in groups or collaborations along that. So maybe I will start with Dan. He's sitting so far away. Maybe you can have this. So I was thinking that you were talking about, or maybe we start with the existing structures that we kind of influenced by, which is the algorithm, and now more and more machine learning and artificial intelligence, and how the logic actually of these technologies assumes some sort of deterministic nature for the human beings, categorizing human and treat them statistically to this reductionist mathematical way that you were talking about. And then I was questioning, so the shift or the move to what you're trying to say about the people counseling and the working groups or councils, would that be like, is it actually a technical question of finding a different form for this technology? Or is it a power question of like owning these forms that already exist, or trying to shift it by being more in control of these forms? And I think this is also in relevance to what you ended on, and what you mentioned of how it's unfair that the data that is collected is mostly from social media, which a lot of people are not even existing in this like pool of data. So is it a power structure of existing there, putting our data or whatever data that we want to dictate this artificial intelligence, or deserting and forming a different technique or different technology?
Well, excuse me. Apologies if I cough into the microphone. It might cause a bit of static. So I personally don't really feel that there's much traction in sort of data activism, or I don't really feel that we're in any way empowered by attempting to recontrol our data or any of this kind of thing. For me, it doesn't have a sense that any sort of leverage. I guess what I'm trying to talk about is something that tries to be non-dualistic about it. So it's both of the other things that you mentioned. It is about power. It is about, without permission, trying to constitute ourselves as the collective subjects to which these things are being done, and saying, basically, hold on. Let's just stop there for a minute, and because we have some other things to say, we have some other desires, we have some other priorities, but also the sort of residual feeling that of course the evolution of technologies is not pre-given. That the exact forms of machine learning as they are intensifying right now, they really are intensifying. I mean, just incredibly, are clearly toxic. But that to me doesn't mean that. If they were in some way, if there was another kind of relational space that was including and regenerating these technologies, they may be something different. So it's a different society and a different technology at the same time.
I mean, I have to add that I think Alexei Radinsky is probably much better suited to deal with this. But for example, like the socialist cybernetics, there's a kind of a meeting of Danish programmers that always look at other political forms of organization of technology. So Soviet internet, cybersyn, Latin American cybernetics, that the models that we live with are part of what was happening because of neoliberal economics, and what won out economically in terms of the technology we can use, and the ideologies that define and describe those technologies. So it's not like the technologies themselves. It's not only that they're not neutral, they're actually developed in the service of capitalism. And I have to point out that IBM mainframe computer that was used to partially operate CyberSyn was then later implemented to operate the implementation of the Chicago School in Chile. And that's something, but that, that was not a very sophisticated, in terms of the programming that went into operating it. But it's kind of ironic that the actual machine was used for both purposes. But I have to say that I think it's like, to imagine that the only sort of technological apparatuses that we could live with are the ones that we have is, for me, that's maybe not the right answer. Or that there could be other technologies imagined and implemented. And they have been, they just weren't, they lost out in an economic battle.
Okay, so maybe on that I can move a bit more to what I wanted to ask Kader, which is maybe again deserting from this like technologies or the idea, or maybe one of the major questions to a lot of these technologies is the idea of inclusion and how to create technology that can be inviting or presenting all the complexity of humanity and not being reductive. And what you were talking about is more of a meeting in the actual space. So it's a step out from this like, I don't know if I should call it obsession with technology, but it's a legitimate obsession, I think. But it's more going back, even you called it the agora, so it's going back to some idea of the idea of democratizing the conversation and being inclusion. And I want to ask again also the question of the form, of how to create such a space to be always keen that this space stays inclusive, but in the same time doesn't close to an echo chamber of artists or a certain discourse that is just repeating itself. And especially with the question that you posed with the post-colonial discussion in a place like Paris, again, it brings this question of like, how do you have a conversation between the oppressor and the oppressed, or the privileged and the non-privileged? How can you be inclusive to such conversations or such dialogues, and not to end up in this like sworn-on groups, as put in the introduction?
I mean, I really I come from an history of denial, and I think that the first stake of we have to face, it's not transgress, but really like being able to give denial is very complex things, because it's politically it's a tool, on both sides. The French narrative was, as the French great narrative, national narrative, has written the history of the others, of the people that it was colonizing. But also, as Edouard Glissant says, we need to claim the right for opacity. It's a very complex thing, this question of denial, And the reason I really wanted to create a space, it could have been anything. It happens that we found a house, but it could have been, I don't know how you call this in English, les ronds-points. When you arrive in an highway and you have this roundabout. This is the idea. It could have been a place like that where people come and live, etc. And at this point, I mean, I'm not living at La Colonie. I mean, like 4 days ago, Akil Mbembe was there. He said, "Oh, you are not here. I met your sister. You're a star, Kader, but your sister, she's a galaxy." I mean, La Colonie, it's an oasis. It's an idea that of course I said our home, but it's our home to all of us. It's a place, and I wish there will be more places like that, like Rond-Point. By the way, the Rond-Point has been the main stake of the Gilets jaunes movement. It's very important to understand. And also Michel Serres wrote a lot on this idea of the Rond-Point. Why I like this idea of a place where you can come and turn to other directions, because I think it's a good answer to the denial culture in which I think since very early age, our mind is educated and formatted to. And here I'm back to what they were talking, you and him, about artificial intelligence. Because I really think that one of the biggest mistakes is to, not only with artificial intelligence, but in general, when we talk about the virtual, the technological virtual, to address it as a new thing. I think, like Foucault explained in his critique of biopolitics, biopolitics are artificial intelligences. I mean, the police, the government, the school, the hospital, they do not exist really. It's a virtual thing that acts into the realm, but it's a virtual thing. And I think, I would say, it's extremely difficult, and even I'm still working on it, to unlearn from this master. I'm using the psychoanalytical terminology of Jacques Lacan, that really like drives you, or Freud, driften, that drives you, because when we try to elaborate unlearning spaces, which is like colony, because I start to be a bit tired with this decolonial terminology. The most important is to understand we need to unlearn, to deconstruct, and then the day after we reconstruct what we did, and then endlessly, because we need to take care of a sort of handless innovations or productions of ID to act. And that's why for me the articulation between something very concrete and something much more difficult, I'm still working on the term, I like to say unlearn, it's crucial today.
So maybe thinking also about like, or maybe moving a little bit again, maybe to Dania and Johannes, and moving from the virtual and this idea of constructing to the power of the imagination, maybe, in actually creating what they both and like Kader and Tom talk about. So my question, to link it to the whole conversation also, is the imagination and also relation maybe back to power of the structure that we exist already in. So in case of Johannes, I think it's very interesting how the identitecture, they call it, of creating these like artificial personas kind of breaks the idea itself of the unity of the self, this like Cartesian Kantian idea of the one individual. So it challenges the individuality not by creating group, but breaking the individual, him or herself. But it's still, the challenge that it faces, that it's already existing in a pre-structure of the world that still deals with the individual identities, or in the bureaucracy created by the artificial intelligence, for instance, and other structures. So how does this desertion or retreating to break the self itself functions in a bigger picture that does not acknowledge this form?
Well, the project is that it doesn't function, and I think that's why it's such a desertion, and why I hope it seems really pointless and ridiculous. I think this is very important to have this notion of subjectivity as something fundamentally broken. Freud and Marx say decentered. That might be something a bit more intellectual or theoretical, but I would say that the emotional framing of that is broken. It's and then it doesn't really matter what you do yourself and what your desires, drives, ambitions, and I would even say identities are. And this is something with a bit of care I say, we are all decentered, broken, and fragmented, and that's one of the strongest features of capital, to use against every body. And I think this is something that I want to make clear with attacking the self, attacking myself, and its manifold identities, that this is a condition that also has a huge potential of unifying these broken subjectivities, and thereby actually forming small experiments of formations, maybe, to move further. I think this is sort of the kind of more the back end of this idea.
I think you said something in your presentation about upsetting or aggregating the subjects. Is that what you mean by facing them with their also fragmented identities that they never really admit? Or?
Let me reframe this. There's this idea of that we all have to exist in every day is that we are rational beings. And of course, again, Freud, Lacan, it just doesn't really work out. And I think that's maybe also to kind of get your idea in, that's the power of a reverse engineered AI would be for me to incorporate these machines into our fragmented subjectivity so they drive us in a way, but then give it parameters so rationality is not fetishized and the capitalist principles of value productions are not fetishized, but other principles guide these irrationality machines that are our subjects combined with AI. Maybe this is something that The Witch exemplifies for me, because I, as Johannes Paul Raether, would have taken hopefully more precautions to walk with Gallium into an Apple store, but she, as me, said, no, you have to have this in your hand. You have to really give this to the people so they can feel the metal and they can bring this to the devices that are in this space. And I think this is maybe a bit of a, drastic or kind of simplistic way of allocating rationality and irrationality in this. But this is what I would like to kind of get at, is, and it, yeah.
Can I say something? I totally agree with you in this sort of what I would call, quoting Tarek al-Haris, this Lebanese very interesting critic of literature and philosophers, when he says, in the end of the day, we are witnessing today a bodily reality crisis. The subject is not anymore this entity that it used to be, the Foucault subject, the Marx subject of the production. The subject has a YouTube account, a Facebook account, WhatsApp account, email account. So it's fragmented. Is really like heavily fragmented through a cloud in which the other individual are also leaking into him and is linking into them or her, if you prefer. I think we are all leaking into the other, and the other are leaking inside us. Because of this, we are not still yet into, still we are in the cyborg bodily reality now. It's possible, prosthetics today are super sophisticated. But much more concerning is this subject crisis, which is a bodily reality crisis. And how, again, we can take care of this is just by rebuilding a social body. Rebuilding a social body where we can meet with all our different subjectivities. And as far as I'm concerned, I have experimented moments which weirdly could sound technological at all. I'm talking about trances, ritual of trances, in which I have seen bodies experimenting what artificial intelligence will never be able to do. Because you need a body for that. You need a body to be dispossessed, rather than when we say he's possessed by a spirit. No, he's dispossessed from his body, and that's why I agree that there is something, there is an important stake to understand the subject has a sort of body, to repair.
Yeah, I just want to say, because I really agree with Johannes on there's some kind of reversal of rationality sort of idea. Because what I got out of your stuff as well was like, it's very playful, right? This is like, I found in a mischievous way, right? And, or that's how it was for me. And if you really look into machine learning and neural networks, and, they're pretty cool actually in what they do. And it's kind of nerdily fascinating to see how they work. But if maybe there are people here who are quite into it already. If you really look into the guts of it, you'd be absolutely horrified that anyone could seriously think of this as a technology to order society or drive cars. It's really, it will fail. It will fail and fail and fail, and so badly. But of course, because so many agendas are invested in it, it will continue to be forced, and the damage will be taken by people in whatever situation, even if it's just a random pedestrian crossing the road, who aren't complying, with its limitations. It's crazy, but I think it has a lot of potential as a technology of surrealism. It's pretty playful stuff, and that's where it should be. That's where it should be. It's not run society with it, but can play games with it. Yeah, definitely not games, online games, but mess with your perceptions, mess with your expectations. That's what it's really good for.
Interesting. So maybe on this note of the surreal, or maybe I can move to Diana's, I think, to weave in maybe one of the other, how I saw it, like a proposition of looking at this through the imagination, or the play between actually the factual and the imagined, or the fiction. And what I like you said, the power of the traveled word. So again, it's the literature. It reminds me also of like folk stories, how it carries itself, and now maybe in a more modern world, solidarity between different movements, and even in creation, fictional characters that travel, and you find it in another protest somewhere else. And so to think of the group work or the collectivity in that sense of a very broad network, if I can say it, that plays between the imagined and the real and the fact. I can also relate it to the same idea of, is that possible with the tactic of deserting also? Do you desert to create such forms of networks and relation, or do you again need the power to be the imposed narrative, or the imposed, or like to affect the imposed narrative, to be able to create such different histories and different lines?
I mean, I think what needs to be deserted is like exactly what Kader is talking about, and that's the old institutions. And it's the institutional logics, it's the books that we've already read and we know and that haven't helped us in the past. So what the desertion is, actually, there's a necessary desertion, and that's, in a way, it's not that we need to kill the old white guys, it's that we need to kill off the logic of the old white guys that brought us to this massive failure. And the sort of the trajectory that I'm trying to bring about is that one that brought about cybernetics, and that one that brought about the kinds of thinking that Donna Haraway, Alla Mitrofanova, Denise Ferreira, that many people are working with, and sort of going back and looking at a history of struggles, and looking, sort of digging deeper to find out what we didn't know, or to challenge what we think we know. And it's like, how do you do what you do? How do you think what you think? Yeah, and like, in whose logic are you following? Whose steps are you following? And there, I think, in a weird way, we are all talking about the same thing, except that I strongly disagree with Kader that social media is building a social body. It's all about building an asocial body or an antisocial body that is connected. So it's.
I was thinking go out from social media.
Yeah, but even there, it's like the alienated body that is produced under the conditions of capitalism almost has, like you say, an oasis, but it's already that online form, that alienated body that is connected, but it's highly individuated, highly, like, everything is about.
Yeah, I agree with you.
But those bodies and those habits carry over into the world we live in, and that is part of how we operate within institutions. I mean, it's like Matrix or something, that we're just like, so those forms are there. And I think what is needed is to, like, what I like with what Johannes is doing, for me that's also extremely, like, important critical reflection on kind of like masculinity and whiteness, and it allows for another way to be and another way to operate. And that it's without being didactic, without being pedantic, because that's where I think it's important to simply do something, and to, like, because then it's like opening up a liminal space where another way is possible. And that's what, I would answer your question, that for me, these fictions, these material, immaterial stories, they have been heard, they have been carried on, but have they been carried into the libraries? Often not. Have they been carried into the textbooks? I mean, often they're like appear on, blink, wave on a screen, a minor mention here, a footnote, or nothing at all. And so this erasure has been done for a kind of mainstream, but that also kills off an imagination. But somebody like Harriet Tubman, she was never quite far, but like now there's a film, but she was erased as a militant, and that now she is recuperated as a militant figure. Her agency is somewhat reclaimed, but for example, like Katerina Zhishvili, who was married to a young Stalin, she's often like historically considered a sort of like dimwit follower that had no agency of her own. She and her sisters were actually coming out of a long line of revolutionaries. They ran a very exclusive French fashion shop in Tbilisi, and they were also a hotbed and drop for Bolshevik radicals and militants. So it's like her own agency has been historically denied, even that she acted in her own thing. And so these stories, like they are partly fictionalized, partly the fictions are lies, okay? And so the nonfiction is in a way important, but it's also important to like feed into an imagination that inspires people, but also allow people to have their own imaginaries. And that's where I think the virtual can be really important, but we're not going to find it in social media. But I also think I don't know.
Can I answer to this? Because I think it's very interesting.
Deserting the media won't help if our imaginations are as limited.
Yeah. I mean, I was not saying that. On the contrary, what we are doing, we are countering the digital media dispossession. This is, but I wanted to continue, not to defend this. I don't want to dispute it. I agree with you. But to give you an interesting reading that I got by Jacques Lacan seminaries of 1972, where Lacan was saying that to a question by students, the 21st century, Mr. Lacan will be religious, as everyone is claiming, and he said, I don't think so. I think that the 21st century will be scientist and capitalist. And let me explain you why. He said exactly what I was saying in the lecture. All ideologies, from communism to religion, they will embrace capitalism. We have seen that. But on which base? On the base of the promise of technology, the promise of science. Daesh is using internet to communicate his things. And I think that what comes after is even more interesting. Lacan said, the real factor that will help capitalism and science to win, to take over on the human psyche, is the universal promise. And universalism is, as a psychoanalytic, through a psychoanalytic critique, producing its counter-reaction, communitarism and individualism. So that's why the 21st century has started with lonely wolf theorist attack from Muslim at the beginning, and now white Christian supremacists behaving the same, like in the US. All attacks are not only perpetrated by lonely wolves, but also by people who film themselves on social and transmit in live the attack on social media. So from this counter-reaction of the universal global hegemony of capitalism and technology, what we have to understand is that indeed, and that's why I was saying that we have to withdraw the people from this alienation to social media, outside the social media, because if you look carefully how social media works, they really played what Lacan was describing, an individualistic, narcissistic behaviors and cultures in which the selfies became like the everyday life celebration of the self, but also an endless fragmentation of the human society in which you have millions of groups gathered around one person, for instance, who speak louder than the others, sometimes 10, sometimes when it's become to fascist party, a bit bigger. And I think one of the core, reason of why it is happening is that digitalization is also de-responsibilizing human beings. When you go to social media, you do a comment, you don't care about whether it will hurt or not. When you walk in the Arkansas in a military base and you kill people with drones, you don't care about, because it's digitalized. The death has been, the act of killing is de-responsibilized by the device and by this in-between space. So that's why I was saying that for me, I'm working exactly on the contrary of that, bringing back the individualities and trying to and also bringing, cutting with this sort of fake social body that is happening on social media, in which indeed we are all leaking in each other. It was more critique.
I was just thinking to maybe open it to the panel.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, well, just a quick mention, because since the idea of imaginary characters and the linking between those and real struggles came up. Excuse me, I just wanted to mention one from my own culture, which people probably know about, which is Ned Ludd. And I think, there's a really good book called The Writings of the Luddites by a guy called Binfield. And it's an aggregation of the original, which there isn't much, right? But the original actual the things that Luddites actually said, plus a bit of social history. And it's really good because you don't only get the voices of the Luddites, but you get to understand that they were, embedded within a pretty broad social struggle. There's post-French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, a time of great upheaval in the UK. And they had they weren't just, breaking machines and burning down factories. They were also involved in early unionism, and they had what became Chartism, which was like looking for, the universal, the vote, and they had an idea of a better society. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I actually think that, one thing is we have to make a clear distinction between regression and desertion. Because I think a lot of the right-wing tendencies and the need for some sort of socialization along right-wing lines is very much a social regression. And I find it very interesting that a lot of the more utopian drives came especially because of Darwin's Origin of the Species. And it's also something it's easy to forget what a radical rethink of the world that was. That was a world changer. And that now it's really interesting to see the sort of pseudoscientific documents that are generated in order to convince Christians that I think go to college and go home in rich countries, they go home gay vegans, and that now they know about communism and stuff. That basically now there's an attempt to sort of jive Christianity and Darwin, and so there's really pseudoscientific documents that will explain how the Bible actually does mention dinosaurs. And it's not, these documents are not meant to engage with science, but they're meant to look like scientific discourses to keep Christians happy. And then social media provides these awful, awful Finland doesn't exist conspiracies or the flat earth, because those are now the fringe beliefs. And that for people, many mainstream Christians, and also in Western Europe, I don't know where all places, America for sure, they absolutely believe that dinosaurs and people had friendship alliances or just, cohabitated. And this is something that's an extreme regression, and that is some kind of desertion, but it's also a regression. And I think, for me, the question would be how does desertion operate? I mean, I prefer retreat and regroup and then prepare for the next battle. But that's it.
Can I propose something?
Yeah, sure.
There? Does it work? Yeah. Maybe the concept of distortion would be helpful, because it doesn't put you in another place, but kind of put you right in the culture war, but you might be sort of not readable within it. And I think that for my practice, I think for an artistic practice, that's quite productive to desert from the polarizations that the culture war kind of forces certain practices into, positioning themselves on that or that side. And I'm not speaking against having a political Haltung in German, I don't know what, attitude or a backbone, or to be clear in what kind of society you want, but the methodologies and the aesthetics and the emotions, if they run through modes of distortion and through producing unreadable bodies, unreadable materials, aesthetics, then I think it's a way forward, I would imagine, or it's a sidestepping that's productive, because we need to, as artists on the left, we do need to develop tools and methodologies to counter the alt-right's appropriation of exactly these appropriation and irony tools that there are. And if we don't have something like that can distort, that can, and I'm saying it, appropriate in a responsible way, and that can do that with a means without basically trashing weaker bodies, then I think we're pretty lost on that, like really, on that good side, you know, that's always very clear and always very understandable. And I think that's what art can contribute to, is to go in there and develop these fragments, tools, and methodologies of unreadability.
Yeah, I think that opens a lot of more questions maybe, and I think yesterday also it was mentioned this idea of starting from skipping the imposed dichotomies by the fascists to even imagine different ways, whether it was deserting or reappropriating. It can open a lot, but I want to engage actually the audience because maybe some people have questions. Yeah.
Hello, Hans Sakkers. I have a question for, following up your story. And that is that on this moment in Europe there are a lot of groups dealing with the historical past and wrongdoings in the past, especially on colonial past, and they're going to court. And you see the Mau Mau case in the UK, from Kenya, and in Namibia and Germany, and the Sulawesi case in the Netherlands. And you have very interesting and sometimes good organized activist groups. And what they want is recognition, acknowledgement for what happened in the past by the system, or a bigger organization. You see it also not only in colonial past, but also you have in the Netherlands the Shell case in Nigeria. So a company is taken for court by widows and by the ecological activist. And what happened is that in most cases human rights law is used. So you can win cases, that is now clear. And but what happens is that you mostly have a decision by the court on basis of individuals. So individuals are the widows getting restitution and compensation, $20,000 or something, that kind of symbolic gesture. And then the group started this kind of process because they want to have a dialogue. They want to become taken serious by society, by the system. But in the moment that they are extremely successful winning the court case, it's over. They pay the money and the dialogue is gone. So your concept, when I understand well, it's about the agora, democracy, the dialogue, and the future. And what is your opinion how to assess this kind of trend in at least Europe, but also see in, for example, America and other cases, claiming this recognition by individuals on human rights law? And do you think that the effect of winning this case is symbolic enough to do it? Or do you say, well, because with the future and hope and ongoing discourse is more important, you have to hesitate? What do you think?
Thank you for your remark, and I cannot stop to think about the question of restitution, for instance. When you were speaking, the fact that 2.5 years ago, the French President Macron did a speech in Ouagadougou where he said that France will bring back the whole object that has been taken from Africa during colonial time. I've been working on these topics for more than 15 years now, and I can tell you that not only that the speech did not affect me, but I found it, in the light of your question, extremely problematic, because it is not because the former perpetrators decide to repair with money, as you said, or by giving back the object, that he will repair what he has done. We will not bring back the bodies of slavery that are sleeping in the ocean. You cannot repair the crime. It's impossible. We need to understand that reparation is also the unrepairable. And the core stake of what I'm talking about, and this is what we are doing at La Colonie, is to take care of this incredible project of removing the injury that Western modernity is moved by, removing the trash constantly. Like Karima Lazali, psychoanalyst, Algerian psychoanalyst, who wrote a fantastic book that I recommend you called The Colonial Trauma. She speaks about a pact, an agreement between the colonizers and the victim. An agreement, how do you call the pact in English? You know what? Pact. A pact that is actually a perverse. It's a perverse pact. It's a perverse pact in which, for her, the descendant of the victim claiming repair is also not healthy at all. Remember what Frantz Fanon used to say, I don't want to be slave of slavery. It's very important to understand that it's not a matter of receiving money or receiving a president's speech. It's what I was saying before, the aim of La Colonie, and I wish that there will be more spaces like this everywhere, it's to constantly deconstruct the systems that are repressing us, to propose new ones, and even be self-critical. It's an endless process of constructing and dismantling. And this is, for me, what I call the repair. Everyone is asking me, what do you mean by repair? There are so many synonyms, but I would say, I would use another French word, but I think it can be used in English. I think repair, for me, or reparaturen, reparation, or reparation, fixing, from justice reparation to just repairing a shoes or a wheel car, I think they have all in common what I would call the passage. It's a passage. And as an artist, I really believe that creation could be a form of repair because it helps this passage. But it's just a passage. It's not. We should not think in a causal way. There's no effect to expect. This is what I wanted to say.
Any other questions?
Maybe can I ask quickly whether, because this is actually it's for the three of you, and it's just one thing is that because of one thing is the idea that there could be something solved. It's not about solving anything, and I think with Dan it's like this like the sort of data activist as a solutionist attitude, as if we could solve something. And I have to say with Johannes, you're actively not solving, and in fact you're unsolving. So, and I would like you to maybe, because it's like the difference between efficiency or effective, and that would be my question too. I mean, you have already answered my question, I think.
By nodding?
No, by doing.
From the audience there, right? So maybe
Should I say my question? Yeah, please. Thank you. The concept of care came up a few times in your talks, and I was wondering how you relate to it in this kind of age where care can also be used as a tool of neoliberalism, or like optimize, and also oftentimes I see care being used to kind of neutralize the field of emotion that you kind of brought up. So I was just curious, maybe talk more about this notion or how you see it individually.
Did you mean me with care, or no? Okay. Maybe I'm going to try to mend these two things in the room, and because the way I understood you, the care aspect of AI, it's kind of deserting from this idea of efficiency and solutionism, and this is, I guess, so let's bring that together. And I think this is, as you said, dealing from my practice, care cannot be unfolded within the paradigm of capital. I don't think then it's not care anymore in my definition of the term. It becomes a product and a surplus value production, and it can be labeled care, but I don't think that it does what for me an actual process of caring for one another would entail. And there is, I think, a whole other panel to be done on that, what that would be. I do think that, again, unsolutionism or unsolving the contemporary now, the the problems that we have with solutionism is always related to technological the attempt to make the things more efficient, to kind of invent a technology that makes it more magic and more fast and more hard and more clean. And I do think that this is the most important task, to really make more problems and really get yourself in the way of these efficiency regimes. And I think this is sort of like, without that the background that you were talking about, I feel very affected by this. This is the sort of repair that you could exert as an individual, as an artist maybe, towards this humongous machine of capitalism. I think this is really what you can do. You can try to establish that passage, you know, to actually get yourself in the way of these technologies of solution.
Do you want to answer?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think Johannes kind of nailed it from my point of view. I think care is incomputable. You know, it's definitely talked about a lot. I mean, I think that's one of the kind of frontiers for AI, as a way of solving this last bit, in a way, the bit that hasn't been controllable, and it can't be done within this people-machine framework, and so there's a possibility of it choking on that, I think. My idea of care, I mean, I'm still trying to figure it out, and I'm maybe a bit late to the game, you know, and so I'm reading other people who perhaps understand it more than me. But for me, it connects with a political tradition that does make sense to me, which is of mutual aid and solidarity. That, to me, is the politicized form. So, yeah.
Maybe I can add something also to the panel to answer. Sadly, Patricia is not here, but I think part of her topic was about care as a maintenance too. So we're all proposing different ways of creating group work or networks or collaborations. But the question also remains of care as in a way of maintaining such structures or formats that we are building. That has to do with also care about the members. So it comes again to individuals, but not in an individualistic approach, but again to care about the individual in this sense. So it's not a particular question to anyone, but if you wanna, with the question, I think with about care, that comes also this idea of maintaining whatever you're creating or this group's work.
Can I add something to that? As a matter of fact, because Lacan came up so much, this language as the force that's driving me, maybe. I think that I was asked recently, so what pronoun do you use? And I think this is part of the culture wars, right? The idea of how language sort of filters in gender identities and how to express. And I said, I use I as us, which I presented before. I as us attacking not he, her, which is the ascription form, but I. Like, I am making myself us, basically. It's not really a pronoun, but it's a self-description. If I say I say I as us. And I think that's maybe important to note, because I got this idea from an Asian language that always can only relate yourself to someone. So you always say I as friend, I as mother, I as father, I as brother, or whatever. And I think that's very beautiful, because it kind of reverts this idea of like being so concerned how someone else ascribes you with self-ascription of an interdependent I. And I think we need to really learn this. from multiple sources, not just from this Asian language, but like we really need to re-ascribe ourselves as interdependent, and that contains an I and an us. And the als in German, or the as, is always this connector between the two, and that always needs to be there.
Can I say something about the care? I think I would go back into something very, at some point, concrete, to understand that how we came up, when I said we, so since what is supposed to be the rise of Western modernity into the idea of repair. We actually, repair or reparaturen or reparation, or I mean every word that is using this Latin roots come from the Latin reparare, which means going back to the original state, return to the original state. And what I found interesting in my research was many years ago is that in non-Western cultures, traditional cultures, broken object, broken ceramic pot in Japan, you all know that, the kintsugi art, which repair them and highlight the injury of the cup, or the calabashes in all African society, that when they are broken, they are repaired with staple or strings, but keeping visible the injury of the object. I started to be very interested in why these objects, when they were brought during the 19th century in the Western Wissenschaft, science field of ethnology, anthropology and ethnology, have been put aside. In Munich, for instance, at the Völkerkunde Museum, I discovered that many of wooden objects which were painted were scratched by the anthropologists because for them painting was Western. An object from Africa should have been in wood. A savage object has to be wood, raw. In the Quai Branly in Paris, and then in many museums, I'm sure here too, most of the objects which were repaired, leaving the injury visible, in kisses, so sculptures, masks, calabashes, they were really like forgotten in the storages, considered as impure objects. And needless to say that the most impure objects were the ones which were included a tin box piece or something coming from the West, a button, a yellow copper nail. This was not supposed to be impure. So I started to focus on how much what was actually playing here is this polarization which exists between Western modern conception of the repair that aims at returning at the idea of the original, because we never come back to the original state, only to the idea. So by removing the injuries, we back again in this, what I was talking about before, removing the injury of the trace of the injuries, writing the history of the others, removing any trace, any what Karim Al-Azali again called the colonial pact, the pacte colonial. And on the contrary, traditional societies, I don't like this word traditional, but non-modern, pre-modern societies, where have been so much, even in the West, it's not only an African thing, cultivating the injury as a sign of social recognition. I'm thinking about scarification, I'm thinking about how scarification, injuring the body, was celebrating this natural specificity of things that is then injury and then repair. And I think to care about something is definitely to again unlearn from this idealization of, as you said before, efficiency, or that repairing means to be able to return at the original state, which means to control time, to be able to rewrite the story of the time of the body. And I think it's not that easy here, because, okay. Yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to kind of share a thought off the back of that, really, which is how much that relates to, I think, makes me think of current machine learning models, in the sense that the visibly progressive, in a modern sense, part of the machine learning community would come under the general heading of FAT, right? FAT something, FAT star, FAT, but fairness, accountability, and transparency. And a lot of what those right-on technical people, the people who are the more socially concerned end of the machine learning spectrum, are trying to do is take the models of machine learning, which embed, all what's called the biases of society in, word to vec, which has, all of the biases built in, and repair it, and try to fix it, and try to do exactly what you're talking about. This really visibilized it for me. They try to rub it away so that it will operate fairly. And how kind of sort of, this is exactly the back to front tactic. What machine learning models are doing, but they're not seen that way, I think, is really capturing at scale all the pain in society. That's what we should look at them as. Look at that. That's horrifying, isn't it? I mean, doesn't that move us to care? That is absolutely awful. But instead, what's seen as the right thing to do, and I mean, I totally get it where they're coming from. These are nice people, right? Are trying to rub it away.
But that's something that, for me, what strikes me is that it's not just like this regression, because it's a kind of a desire to return to a more perfect state that was never. And that's a very Judeo-Christian thing, But yeah. But that's also, for me, that's this difference between efficiency and effectiveness. And it's sort of like the neoliberal logic that is, I mean, on the home front, played out by Excel sheet or by tables, but it becomes a way of like forgetting all of the things that you can't put in a column, and how do you undervalue them, and that when you have the sort of pre-modern places that are like running parallel to the modern one, where for like Navajo people in weaving, it shouldn't be perfect, and it's like that's wrong, and there has to be a little hole so that the spirits can travel through, and until today that's how things are, and if one would make even for taking something to market, weaving, and that's a code. I think that's the funny thing, is that that's a coded way to weave. That thing should never be perfect, because that's an undesirable. And I forget why. That is, but there's a reason. So something bad.
Any more questions?
I have a question about the term you used, the appropriation of the field of emotion, also in relation to the previous two questions. I'm asking myself how the appropriation of emotion is possible without being appropriated by a certain ideology or in the service of national discourse. And also what other modes of gathering, particularly physical gathering, could be possible in terms of the appropriation of emotion. I'm thinking of more intimate histories of collective trauma, like the sex slave woman who were forced to send out to Japanese military bases. Probably this kind of, this kind would need, I think, different modes of gathering, deconstruction and construction. And also their brave moments in public to talk about their experiences also became actually in the service of the fight between the two nations, Japan and Korea. And so that's my question. What do you think about that?
I mean, of course, you were talking about the Korean women who were
not only Korea, they were actually also many other East, South Asian countries.
I mean, all the parts where Japan has colonized, Manchuria, Vietnam, South Korea, of course. I mean, I cannot. I've been working in South Korea a couple of times, especially on the way, because it really interested me from my perspective as a Franco-Algerian descendant of colonized people, the hegemony of Japan in the region and the way they have been actually applying a modern project. This is something we don't know from here, but when you go to South Korea and you do researches, you really discover that the colonial project of Japan was ruled by this sort of modern promise that even the ruler of Korea, South Korea, Park Chung-hee, was an official in the colonial imperial army of Japan during the Second World War. And what he applied to his citizens, to his people, was the continuation of colonialism. So with this obsession that, contrary to Vietnam and communism, he has the obsession, because he chose America and capitalism, to grow the economy of the country at any prices. And then Chan Du-hang, this is the period of time I've been working in on the massacre of Gwangju, May 18. The General Chan Du-hang was just following the other of rulers who have been slaughtering their own people in different moments of Korean history. And I like to relate this so-called moment of Korean sovereignty with the colonial moment you were mentioning, because I think that we're back again here in what Karim Al-Azali called the colonial pact. We can also call it, this sort of abused children syndrome that the descendant of the victim are reproducing the crime that the occupant were perpetrating on them. I think that what I found and to be honest, I am extremely strong with the Korean society, is that most of the project I'm doing film are made of interviews. So I had to spend hours with survivors from massacres in interviews. There were many different moments, extremely tough, but there was one moment with an old man almost on the top of a tower, of glass tower, was telling us an incredible story that he lived when he was a student during the demonstration of May 18, and of course everything that has followed after. Most of the time when we talk about trauma, it's not the trauma itself, it's what comes after. And most of the psychiatrists, even in South Korea, there's this woman who explained to me that the PTSD is the most difficult stake to deal with than the trauma itself. But I will never forget this man who was answering after, let's say, an hour and a half, probably 2 hours of interview. I was a bit jet lagged also, so I was like writing the answer. I had a translator on my side, very nice guy, Jae-young-ji. And suddenly, Jae-young-ji, which was supposed to translate me each answer in English, really like collapsed and started to cry in the middle of the interview. So I cut the camera. I said, "Are you okay?" He said, "I'm coming." And he left the room. He went to the toilet. So I stayed 10 handless minutes with this man in front of me, who was not crying. And he was turning his head, looking at the window. It's very emotional. And then when Janji arrived after, I said, "If you want, we stop the interview and you can tell him this." And he asked the man, and the man said, "No, I want to speak. Not because of you. I want to speak because of the camera. The camera helps me to get rid of my trauma." The theoretical, we know that the camera is an incredible tool. Jean Rouch, when he did The Maître Fou, also proved that it's even a staging process. But I never experimented myself a such situation where the need to talk about your own story was at any price, even even speaking in front of someone you don't know has come from the opposite side of the earth. He was talking about very personal things and how difficult it was to live after he lost everything. And it's a very sad story, but I think that again it's a passage, and artists really like create like this moment where the dynamic of the experience by itself is much needed, but it doesn't mean that it will heal. And to be honest, then from this story, I then suddenly look at the Korean society differently, and I interviewed other people, also shamans, and psychiatrists, and historians, and I discovered that it's a society that is deeply traumatized. deeply traumatized. I mean, and for me, it has not only to do with the massacres. It has also to do with what you were saying before, of course, the crimes that have been committed against the women, so the colonial crimes, but also other things, like most of the historians I have interviewed explained to me that the Japanese have proceeded with something which is very similar with the French in Algeria by using humiliation. They have considered the South Korean as savage. And this, what we call in Arabic, hogra, in North Africa, especially in Algeria, it's still extremely, extremely strong. We have no idea how much humiliation can traumatize generations and generations forever. So that's why, again, to come back to this and to you, of course, I don't think that you can get rid of it. But by creating, I think the only thing we can repair or mourn situations from individual to massive, traumatic trauma from individual to collective is with culture and affection. Culture at very large, writing, films, anything, and of course affections. And I will finish with this because it's very important. Fethi Ben Slama, the psychoanalyst, says in the film also that they are the most fragile individual who actually incarnates collective trauma. There is a correlation between the individual and the collective when it comes to trauma. You cannot separate them.
I think maybe one last question.
Thank you. I actually wanted to continue a bit on this theme. Also by returning to the polis, the Greek city-state. In the Greek city-state, visibility, the coming together of the body politic, this visibility in the agora, in the marketplace, was used to create, on the one hand, accountability, and on the other hand, to create a form of unity, right? But as you already said, this unity was there to create a slave state. So the unity and the accountability, the care as maintenance, is there to create. Michael Hanchard has recently written a lot about this in his book on democracy and discrimination. So the visibility is made to create an exploited class, right? And care for the collective is used to create an exploited class. And for instance, if you take it a bit more to the individual already, trans was, I think, mentioned a bit. Like trans care, trans health care is one of the contemporary instances where trans healthcare functions as a eugenic force to create a visible outsider, right? To represent this injury of gender almost by this demand of forced sterilization and bad hormones, bad medication basically. So that the coming together of the body politic in this visibility and hypervisibility sometimes is not only reparative, right? It is also creating and maintaining exclusion.
I think I take it as a remark because I share a view as well. And if maybe you can take another question because we are here also for the public.
But I think I can also.
Did you mean me specifically? No. It's like, okay. Yeah. I thank you for that comment. It was really, I think it really opened up the whole notch on visibility is something that I'm very, very, I'm struggling with, but also really working through to have it again here. I think that's something that needs to be practiced in all communities much more. Like who is visible with what sort of degree of accountability and the kind of the assignments of power that come with it and responsibility. And I think that's something where I would say, yeah, that's really not talked about a lot, because I think that's how I perceive it. We're still at this collectivization idea, usually in the left, and the hubs and nods of people who then become very visible, and we talked about social media, that arise from a completely medialized society and how it relates to the invisible people who do the labor and who are like kind of really invisibilized, as you say. That's something that probably would also need another panel, I guess.
I think it can be related to your idea. I remember it like you explained it beautifully. The remembering, it's like including the amputated limb. So basically, re-including what was already forgotten or pushed away or marginalized, to remembering those on the margins or not visible to the
and that's why I was also underlining the notion of denial as something crucial we have to take care about, because when you mentioned that the physicality also creates slavery, talking about the Greece, this agora moment, I mean, mapped like that, of course, and in many societies, not only the Greece, I'm much more concerned by the fact that, because we've been talking a lot about artificial intelligence, we all know that it also creates a new Lupen proletariat today, with the Uber workers, for instance. And then they are not, I mean, they are, for me, they are part of this digital body extension, because you don't anymore pay them by cash. It's only, I mean, everything is of course digitalized, so they cannot really get access on this money. They are paid like shit. We know that. And I don't know. I like the way you addressed it. I think it's relevant. And for me, it confirmed the fact that I'm also like very ambivalent on these things. I'm still working on, you know. I think we are attending really like a prehistoric moment of digitalization, and probably the most problematic deal that we have to find with it is to be able to invent out of this, or on top of this, a new language. That is the question, in which I think, I guess, notion of physicality has to be reinvent again itself.
Oh yeah, I think we have to have room for one last question from Joy. Right? Gonna go. And I would just say something that interoperability is necessary, and it's like this interdependencies, and that I like the notion of affection, and that allowances for like opacity, ignorance, generosity, when to be present, when not, when to be visible, when not, and in a way that understanding once you work with any, like you in relation to all the things and the beings that you're in relation to, you know, about your daily life, but also kind of like, and then there's the sort of localized moments, and then there are also the more internationalized ones, and allowing that not everything is as you are, as you would will it, but also that not everyone would will it or want it as you would. And that's something which I see.
Hi, I just have a quick follow-up question to what Micah introduced. Is in your presentation, you are using images from what looks like a Vogue and ballroom scene, which is a very specific demographic, and I wonder if you could talk about the relationship of those images to the content of your presentation, and also what we're talking about now about visibility and care and these other sort of systems.
I cannot thank you more about this question, because I just thought during this conversation that I forgot to answer to her question about one point, which I think it's very important. The field of emotion, of course, as you asked me before, how to do to make it, or to protect it from dark forces. How it could not become a nationalistic factor and tool to repeat actually the same scenario that I don't know, look at Goebbels giving a speech, and then you will understand why Goebbels or Hitler and Kulthum have been this incredible human together, and galvanized so many people. I think by opening or addressing the notion of the field of emotion, also exactly as you said, she just mentioned a ballroom of the voguing. If we would have limited La Colonie as a space for debate and thinking and theory and claiming, etc., denying that the emotion is also what can help to, the people after the talk, after the theory, to just have a drink, to just have a dance, to just be themselves. We will succeed in creating what we called in French un lien social, actually a common ground. And this is what I care a lot. I've been, and we have all been in that things, in many symposiums, small, big, etc. At the end, you remember these moments where we have exchanged with some people in a very interesting way. We want to continue, but there's no place to have a drink. There's no place to, to continue. La Colonie is very much not separating the moment to have fun, actually, and the moment to really think. And I think this is crucial to be able to demystify the field of emotion. What I was attacking on the before when I was talking about the left is that the left has, in a way, the French left especially, in a very snobbish way, neglected this. It has broken the thread or the bridge which used to connect the political project to the people. And the voguing is very interesting because in Paris, for instance, it's a genre of battle that gather, racialized people, but it's absolutely not part of. It's still marginalized. This is what I'm telling you. It's still marginalized. And what we at La Colonie, we host this ball once or two times a year, and at every time you really feel that this reappropriation of the body, of the social body I was talking about, should not be only in theory, on paper, but also just really make it alive, So that's why I think it's by inventing our forms of being together and of sharing together, and without any complex of elitism, also trying to organize debate where you don't have only theory, but activists also, which is not easy, believe me, by experience, which is not easy.
Okay, I think we exceeded our time. Unless there's any final comments from the panel here, you want to add something? We can just maybe move to the dance and the drinking. But first, I hand the mic back to Sven. You want to make a conclusion remark?
No conclusion. Let me just thank all of you. Let me just state that this was indeed definitely a far cry from sad politics, right? A term that Natasha used yesterday. And one comment made by Dan really is ringing in my mind, this commitment to the possible over the probable. And I think all of you and all of us are committed to the possible over the probable. Thank you very much.
I'm very, very sorry. I just want to thank you, Dina. You did wonderful work. Thank you, all the speakers. Thank you, all of you, for joining. I just want to acknowledge, I want to highlight that there is a network of people who don't necessarily take stage, but take care of the lights. They're in the kitchen. They will come us at the door. And I just want to really, really, really sincerely thank the ever-expanding team of Buck. This has been amazing. Thank you. Great.